An insider dropped something crushing about the Aston Martin project this week. Even if you rip the Honda power unit out of that car tomorrow and bolted in a Mercedes, the fastest engine on the grid, the car would still only be fighting somewhere around the midfield. That is how deep the problems go. Aston Martin paid Adrian Newey $30 million a year and gave him a 2.5% stake in the team to build them a title winner. 3 races into the 2026 season, they have 0 points, 2 drivers risking lasting nerve damage, and a car that cannot finish a Grand Prix. That insider verdict did not come out of nowhere. It landed next to a deep technical breakdown that traced the Honda vibration crisis back to a single choice, and it leads straight to Newey's door. When Newey arrived at Aston Martin in March of 2025, he wanted the Honda power unit shortened. He wanted it squeezed. He wanted the engine package made as small as it could be, so that he could open up aerospace around the rear of the car and create downforce where other teams could not. The way to do that was to double stack the battery inside the electronics housing and move the MGU-K from its normal spot behind the engine to a brand new spot ahead of it. That is not a small tweak. That is a total rebuild of how every major part inside the power unit connects to every other part. It changes the weight spread, the vibration patterns, and the shake paths through the whole unit. Honda had never tested that setup at full scale. And Newey wanted it done on a tight timeline because he showed up months late and the car was already behind. Honda went along with it. They had little choice. When a designer with 14 title wins and a £30 million yearly salary makes a request, it carries the weight of something closer to an order. At the January 2026 launch in Tokyo, Honda showed off the design as a 2-tier layout built to make the package as compact and as short as it could be, because the team had asked for it. The word choice matters there. The team asked for it, not Honda, not the engine department. The team, meaning Newey. The battery layout splits the battery and control electronics into 2 layers, a setup even more extreme than what the new rules call for. By the time the Australian Grand Prix came around, Newey was openly accepting that the mix of the engine, and possibly the MGU-K as well, is the source of the vibration. He knew where the problem was coming from. He could not fake it, because the cars were shaking apart in front of the whole world. Honda still cannot find the exact cause. Their engineers have accepted that many linked factors create the vibration, and because the problem is so tangled, fixing just one piece might not solve anything. The vibrations went beyond everything Honda measured on their test rig at their base in Sakura, Japan. What the engine did in lab conditions, and what it does inside Newey's tightly packed chassis, turned out to be totally different things. The gap between test rig results and real-world behavior came as a real shock to Honda's team. And when you go back through the chain of events, trace every choice, follow every timeline, every trail leads back to the same place. The unusual layout that Newey pushed for is the top suspect behind all of it. Honda has not publicly pointed the finger at Newey, but they have made it clear that the chassis packaging plays a big role in the vibration. The reading from the paddock is less kind. In other words, we did what you asked, and now it does not work, and we have got egg on our face. This choice did not just bring vibrations. It also cost Aston Martin 4 months of build time. Newey restarted the whole car concept when he arrived, throwing out what the team had been working on and putting in his own vision, a vision he had been sketching during his Red Bull gardening leave, before he even started work at Silverstone. The Aston Martin AMR26 did not go into the wind tunnel until mid-April of 2025. Most rival teams had been testing their 2026 cars since the December before. That 4-month gap hit every stage of the build, from aero testing to crash testing to the on-track work that sorts a fast car from a slow one. Andy Cowell, the former team boss who had been running things before Newey showed up, stepped aside because he could not work alongside Newey's methods. The exit was Cowell holding up his hands and walking away because he could not deal with the way Adrian runs things. The genius got total control, and total control built the slowest car on the grid. This is where the story stops being about engineering failures and starts being about real danger. Before the season opener at Albert Park, Newey held a press conference that shocked the whole paddock. He stood in front of the cameras and laid out something no technical chief should ever have to say in public. Fernando Alonso cannot drive more than 25 laps in a row without risking lasting nerve damage to his hands. Lance Stroll's limit is even worse, 15 laps. The Australian Grand Prix was 58 laps long. Neither driver could safely finish half-race distance in the car their own team had built for them. The feeling inside the cockpit is close to being electrocuted while sitting in a chair. That is not a figure of speech. The vibrations are not a soft hum or a small problem. They are violent enough to shake mirrors off the bodywork, knock tail lights loose, and burn through batteries one after another. The health risk has a name: hand-arm vibration syndrome. It is a known workplace health condition that does lasting damage to nerves and blood vessels in the hands and arms. This is something that hits construction workers who use jackhammers and heavy power tools over years of exposure. Aston Martin's drivers are getting the same level of shaking inside a Formula One cockpit after roughly 20 minutes of driving. Think about that for a second. A sport that calls itself the peak of engineering, the cutting edge of car technology, the safest racing series in history. and 2 of its drivers are at risk of the same workplace injury as someone running heavy gear on a building site. The irony goes deeper when you think about the fact that the 2026 rules were built to make the cars safer and more green. Instead, Newey's version of those rules has made a machine that puts its own drivers in danger. That is not a speed problem, that is a design failure at a basic level. During the Chinese Grand Prix in Shanghai, Alonso had to pull out mid-race after losing all feeling in his hands. Onboard cameras caught him letting go of the steering wheel in clear pain, unable to grip it, unable to feel whether he was turning left or right. At the same event, Stroll stopped after roughly 9 laps. In Australia, both drivers pulled out before the finish. At Suzuka, Alonso crossed the line in 18th, a full lap behind the winner, roughly 30 seconds behind the lead Cadillac. A team that did not exist 18 months ago beat the most costly design project in Formula One. And that single finish in 18th was treated inside the Aston Martin garage like a podium. Stroll pulled out at Suzuka too, with a water leak on lap 30. Across 3 races and 6 starts, 1 finish. In qualifying, both Aston Martins have gone out in qual at every single event, sitting on the back row next to Cadillac. That is where £200 million spent on the greatest aero designer in the sport's history has put them, last. Behind everyone. Behind a team that has never raced before. The team's pre-season testing had already been awful. During the second Bahrain test, Aston Martin managed just 128 laps across 3 days, and only 6 laps on the final day after burning through every spare battery they had brought. Their total pre-season mileage of roughly 400 laps was less than half of what even Williams managed, and less than 10% of the mileage Mercedes built up across its 4 customer teams. The word being used across the paddock and the racing press to describe Aston Martin's full 2026 season is write-off. And that verdict looks kind, but the mix of 0 points, real danger to drivers, and a chassis that is slower than the engine gap alone can explain, puts this in a class of its own. And yet the most harmful finding is not about the engine at all. GPS data put out after the Japanese Grand Prix showed something far worse for Adrian Newey in particular. Tracking data open to every team on the grid showed that more than half of Aston Martin's qualifying gap comes from the chassis, not the Honda power unit. The chassis, the car Newey designed. The car trails the pace by roughly 3.6 seconds in qualifying trim. Of that huge gap, about 2.3 seconds comes from the chassis alone. That means, even with a perfect engine, even with the best power unit money can buy, Aston Martin would still be over 2 seconds off the pace on chassis speed alone. The AMR26 is overweight. It is weak through high-speed corners, the exact places where aero matters most and where Newey's tight packaging was meant to pay off. It runs the steepest rake angle of any car on the grid, a classic Newey trait from the Red Bull years that worked well under the old rules, but is giving shrinking and maybe even harmful returns inside a totally different aero rulebook. The side pods have been called a shock, bringing back memories of Mercedes' failed zero-pod idea from 2022. These are not engine problems. These are the direct results of design choices made by one man. Fix every single thing wrong with the Honda power unit, solve the vibration, close the power gap, and you still have a car fighting near the back of the midfield. That is what the insider meant. The engine is only half the story, and it may be the less damning half. On top of the vibrations, the Honda power unit has a separate and large speed gap that makes everything worse. The RA626H is thought to be down roughly 95 horsepower to the best engines on the grid, which puts it close to where Honda was during their rough McLaren years a decade ago. The MGU-K cannot charge at its full 350 kilowatt rate, running closer to 250 kilowatts instead, which means the electrical energy recovery that is meant to give 50% of the car's total power under the 2026 rules is falling well short. Those charging numbers became public after they came up at a Formula One Commission meeting, a never-before-seen airing of a partner's weaknesses that set off clear friction between Aston Martin and Honda. The tag of Honda as raw and short on resources did not go down well in Sakura. That kind of public strain between a chassis designer and an engine maker, 3 races into a deal, tells you everything about the mood behind closed doors. And Honda's role as the only supplier to one team has made every single problem harder to fix. Mercedes, powering 4 teams including its own work squad, built up over 4,100 laps of pre-season testing data across those outfits. Honda, powering only Aston Martin, had roughly 400 laps, a 10-to-1 gap in real-world data before the season even started. When you cannot find a vibration cause, and you have 1/10 of the testing data that your biggest rival has, every step takes longer, and every fix carries more risk. If this story is helping you understand the full picture of what has gone wrong at Aston Martin, subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next chapter of this saga, as the vibration fix heads to Miami. The contrast with what Ferrari has built makes the pain cut even deeper. Enter Loic Serra, Ferrari's chassis technical director. Since October of 2024, Serra took the SF26 from a blank sheet of paper, and from the very start, he chose the opposite path from Newey. Where Newey squeezed the engine package and pushed Honda to redo their power unit layout, Serra worked within the existing Ferrari engine setup and built the chassis to match what already ran well. Where Newey chased maximum aerospace at the cost of everything else, Serra focused on building a strong, stable base made for steady gains over a full season, rather than trying to grab all the speed on day one. The Ferrari mindset from day one was careful work, close attention, and deep data study aimed at making controlled and solid progress. The risk of starting from a blank sheet was always that too many options could pull you off course. Ferrari made sure that did not happen. Ferrari did not lose its way. 3 races into the season, the SF26 sits second in the constructors' standings with 90 points, a 45-point gap to dominant Mercedes, but a result that puts them firmly in the title fight. Charles Leclerc has put in 3 straight podiums and sits third in the drivers' standings with 49 points. Lewis Hamilton, reborn after a brutal 2025 with Mercedes, sits fourth with 41 points and has called his wheel-to-wheel fight with Leclerc in China, with nearly a dozen swaps over a single stint, the best racing he has ever had in Formula One. That is Lewis Hamilton, a 7-time world champion with over 100 Grand Prix wins, calling his current car the best racing of his career. The Maranello team actually built in Hamilton's setup wishes, something that was missing during his final years at Brackley. When a driver of Hamilton's level says the team listens, it means the culture at Ferrari is working in a way that Aston Martin's clearly is not. The SF26 also packs real new ideas, including a rotating rear wing and an exhaust flow device that needed special FIA sign-off. But all of that ambition came inside a reliable package that ran roughly 6,200 kilometers of pre-season testing. Aston Martin ran roughly 400. Ferrari built up 15 times the testing mileage before the first race, and the results show that gap at every single track. The question that everyone in the Formula One paddock is now asking out loud is whether there is a point at which Newey's drive to win will bring total disaster. Because his need to push every limit, the same instinct that built 14 title-winning cars at Williams, McLaren, and Red Bull, is the exact instinct that built this disaster at Aston Martin. The trait that made him great is the trait that may have wrecked this project. The image going around the paddock is of Moses leading his people through the desert, with everyone around him looking at the empty land and wondering whether the promised land is real, whether anyone else can actually see the same land of milk and honey that Newey sees. And at some point, the followers hit a moment where they stop trusting the vision and start asking whether the leader has lost his mind. Aston Martin is barely doing better than a team that has never raced in Formula One before. The Cadillac comparison, a brand new outfit with no history, no Adrian Newey, no £200 million bet on a single designer, and they are finishing ahead of Aston Martin on pure pace. That alone should scare everyone at Silverstone. There is still a case for Newey, and some in the paddock are making it. Aston Martin could yet become a supernova rather than a black hole. Newey's instinct is the kind of mind that, when someone draws a safe circle on the ground and says stay inside, it always needs to know what happens when you step outside it. The problem is that stepping outside the circle this time has cost Aston Martin their whole opening run. And the irony is crushing. The man who designed the Red Bull RB19, the most dominant Formula One car ever built, a machine that won 21 of 22 races in 2023, has now built a car that cannot finish a race without hurting the person driving it. There is one thread of careful hope buried inside the Japanese Grand Prix weekend. A vibration fix tried during Friday practice at Suzuka brought roughly an 80% drop in the shaking. The car felt different. The feeling in his hands was bearable for the first time all season. The vibration went from crippling to livable. For roughly 20 minutes during that Friday run at Suzuka, the Aston Martin acted like a working Formula One car. Alonso could hold the steering wheel without his fingers going numb. He could feel the front tires reacting to his inputs. For the first time in 2026, the car gave him something close to feedback, and then the fix was pulled. The new parts had not been tested for full race distance strength, and running unproven parts in a Grand Prix risks a total failure that could wreck the engine or hurt the driver. So the team went backwards. They took the fix off and raced the old setup, and Alonso finished in 18th. The team thinks the vibration fix can go on properly at the Miami Grand Prix in early May, after the 5-week April break gives Honda enough time to finish the strength testing. Whether that fix goes after the root cause of the vibration, the core shaking issue born from the unusual power unit layout Newey pushed for, or whether it just hides the problem enough to let the drivers finish a race without lasting harm, remains the biggest open question of Aston Martin's 2026 season. Miami is less than 3 weeks away. Everything Aston Martin's bet on Adrian Newey was meant to bring comes down to whether a vibration fix that lasted one Friday practice can hold up for a full Grand Prix. Under the 2026 engine rules, Honda can ask for mid-season upgrades if their power unit falls more than 2% behind the best engine, which it clearly does. But real gains on that front likely will not come before the summer break. The vibration is the pressing crisis, and Miami is the pressing test. 45 points down the road, Ferrari is proof that you do not need wild genius to build a title fighter. You need discipline, the ability to carry out a plan without letting ambition swamp the work. The will to improve what works rather than rip it up and start over. Ferrari got that. Loic Serra got that. And while Newey was pushing Honda to rebuild their power unit to his demands, Serra was quietly building a car that works. If the Suzuka fix holds at Miami, this story goes in a new direction. Newey will have bought himself time, and his track record says he will use that time to find real speed. If it does not hold, the promised land that has been dangled in front of the Aston Martin faithful will stop feeling far away and start feeling like it was never real at all. And Aston Martin will have to face a question that nobody in their boardroom wants to hear. Did they pay £200 million for the greatest designer in Formula One history to build them a car that cannot finish a race? If you want the full story on how the 2026 rules created this chaos in the first place, that video is on screen now.